Okay, here we go with the last installment for this series. Toward the end of this book, Richard Wright is going to discover that there are some like-minded people in Chicago with respect to civil rights. Like-minded black people as well as like-minded white people. He discovers civil rights activism. And I know what you might be thinking, that we're talking about the late 1930s, early 1940s here in this book. And when most of us think about civil rights, we tend to go to the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, the march in places like Birmingham, the I Have a Dream speech in the 60s. And the problem that presents is that it portrays civil rights activism as if nothing was happening before then and nothing happened after. And of course, that's way too simple. And it doesn't have a very good, depiction of what civil rights activism actually consisted of. We've talked about this group of people in this class before, and I told you that in the 1930s, 1940s, and really even into the 1950s, the only predominantly white organization that took up the cause of civil rights was the American Communist Party. Okay? Leftists generally, socialists, anarchists, other groups that kind of existed within the orbit of the American left, they understood the problem that was lack of civil rights, second-class citizenship for certain groups of Americans, and they mobilized in support of them. This is not exactly a really well-known story in American history, but it's a very important one. And it's one that we can see in Richard Wright's writings as well. Before I give you an example from Richard Wright himself, we'll get there. I want to take you back to a point in our class, 1932. It was in that year that 9 African-American kids, they're youths, but all of them are under the age of 18, are accused of raping 2 white girls in Scottsboro, Alabama. Now, there's very little proof that any of this happened, but that's not exactly necessary in this time period, let alone in that setting. There were countless of people who had been executed, whether via court or simply lynched, for very similar accusations as well. So these 9 boys, they are literally boys, are going to go on trial, but what good is a trial if you don't have good legal representation? It's the Communist Party that sent its legal resources, the International Labor Defender, to Scottsboro, Alabama, to get these 9 black boys adequate legal representation. It ends in what you might think of as a tie, as a draw. Okay, in some instances it's a hung jury, but the fact of the matter was, it was the communists that had, more or less saved these African Americans from what would have been probably a pretty dire outcome. My point in telling you this has nothing to do with white paternalism, good-hearted white people that did the right thing. My point is, the communists were very much involved in what me and you might think of as civil rights activism, especially during this time period under examination. And Richard Wright notes that and points to it various times in his writing as well. So what I'd like you to do is open up your book to chapter 16, and it is on, it starts out in 271. He begins talking about some of the activism that the communists are sponsoring, and it spills over into 172, okay? But I'm on page 172, where he's a little disillusioned with the activism of the Communist Party. It's a paragraph that starts out, I was now convinced. I was now convinced. Find that paragraph. I was now convinced that they did not know the complex nature of Negro life, the communists, did not know how great the task to which they had set themselves. They had rejected the state of things as they were, and that seemed to me to be the first step toward embracing a creative attitude toward life. I felt that it was not until one wanted the world to be different that one could look at the world with will and emotion. But these men had rejected that what was before their eyes without quite knowing what they had rejected and why. I felt that the Negro could not live a full human life under the conditions imposed upon him by America, and I felt too that America, for different reasons, could not live a full human life. It seemed to me that then that if the Negro solved his problem, he would be solving infinitely more than his problems alone. I felt certain that the Negro could never solve his problem until the deeper problem of American civilization had been faced and solved. And because the Negro was the most cast out of all the outcast people in America, I felt that no other group in America could tackle this problem of what our American lives meant so well as the Negro could. Now, there's some connections that we need to make there. And the connection is, although the communists were taking up the cause of civil rights or lack thereof, for all intents and purposes, they were telling the people of color, including people like Richard Wright, to sit back, stand down, don't think, just do what we tell you to do. He doesn't take kindly to that, but it's another form of white supremacy, whether this is conscious or unconscious. People of the white variety are making the decisions, and people of the people of color, that variety, those people are expected to take orders. I'm not trying to cast these people as the same individuals that we've discussed, racist individuals in this segment before, but I mean, there is something to be said about that assumed superiority. He also gets really annoyed at what he calls the oversimplification of how the communists come at this race issue. And to give you a good example of what I'm talking about, let's open up to chapter 18, which is the page that I need you to go to is 320. And on page 20, sorry, I just lost track of my spot here. Here we go. In chapter 18, page 320, there's a paragraph that starts out, "Here, then, was something that I could do." Find that paragraph. Here, then, was something I could do. Reveal, say. The communists, I felt, had oversimplified the experience of those whom they sought to lead. In their efforts to recruit masses, they had missed the meaning of their lives of the masses, had conceived of people in too abstract of a manner. Once again, I mean, at least to me, it's this assumed superiority. If you got to know these individuals and gave them positions, maybe not even of leadership, but you gave them the floor and allowed them to speak, and you listened and you educated yourself on where they wanted to take this conversation, the best ways that they thought that they could take it, that would be an effective, path forward. I think that's what Richard Wright is trying to say. There's another context that I think that you can connect to this class too, okay? When he's talking about, the oversimplification issue, he's doing so in the setting of a John Reed Club meeting. Now, the John Reed Club was a cultural outlet that had been organized mostly by communists, but leftists generally speaking. And the whole point of the John Reed Club was to recruit people into the communist movement, to bring in converts through the use of culture, whether that was music or plays, or in the case of Richard Wright, writing. It was to convey a message, to mobilize the masses in a setting or with a message that was easy to understand and in most cases fun to kind of consume. I mean, would you rather listen to a 3-hour speech, or would you like Woody Guthrie to sing you the song that's easy to sing along with and understand the message? So this is the context in which he is saying, this criticism. And ultimately, he's saying, that there might be better ways forward. Doesn't always have to be the party line. So another very vivid example that I think that you can get a lot of mileage out of if you choose to use it in your paper. But one more example before I let you go, okay? And it's one of those things where, I mean, these people at the end of the day, they are your allies. Make no mistake about it. They are on your side. They want, very broadly defined, what you want, but there are internal squabbles with everything, internal disagreements, and you don't always get along. We see a good example of that in chapter 19, which is on page 336 of your book. So what I'd like you to do is to go to page 336 and find that paragraph that starts out, "I talked with white communists." I talked with white communists. Find that paragraph. It's on page 336. "I talked with white communists about my experiences with black communists, and I could not make them understand what I was talking about. White communists had idolized all Negroes to the extent that they did not see the same Negroes I saw. And the more I tried to explain my ideas, the more they, too, began to suspect that I somehow was dreadfully wrong. Words lost their usual meanings. Simple motives took on sinister colors. Attitudes underwent quick and startling transformations. Ideas turned into opposites while you were talking to a person you thought you knew. I began to feel an emotional isolation that I had not known in the depths of the hate-ridden South." In other words, very appreciative of this effort that you're making with respect to civil rights, but with all due respect, you're doing it wrong. You've got these people wrong, and the reason I know that you're wrong is these are my people. This example that I'm going to connect to the class is going to be a little bit out of the chronology here. It's going to be in the 1960s, in particular 1963, and it's going to be from Martin Luther King, who's going to write this letter from the Birmingham jailhouse. He was, if you recall, arrested for not having a permit to protest in Birmingham in 1963. It's where you see the police dogs and the fire hoses, so if that brings back, that jogs your memory, okay? In any case, I told you at the time that letter from the Birmingham jail was a sharp critique, but it wasn't of Bull Connor, it wasn't of George Wallace or any of the other racists within the establishment. The people that he's calling out, the people that he's saying, we find it hard to wait. That's the white clergy, right? It's the white churches that were telling Martin Luther King, slow down, be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. You're not going to change racist hearts and minds overnight. This is Martin Luther King pushing back and saying, when you are haunted, when you are constantly reminded that you are a second or third class citizen, maybe you can understand why we find it so difficult to wait. And if you think about it, it's not that much different than what Richard Wright is trying to tell these leftists within the Communist Party. You think you know us, but you don't really know us. You think you know what's best for us, but we have a different idea because we've had all of these experiences where you haven't had, and you don't seem to be all that interested in listening to and in hearing us tell you, okay? So again, a very good example, and it's an even better connection in my mind, even though it's coming during two time periods of civil rights activism. So what we have here is the summation of this book, an examination of it. I'm hopeful that you can see the deep and, very vivid parallels between white supremacy as we've discussed it in this class and white supremacy as Richard Wright has experienced it in his book. We see it in a Southern context, we've seen it in a Northern context, and I'm hopeful that these videos allow you to not only break down this reading and score a very good score on paper too, but I'm also hopeful that it helps you understand the world of race relations in the United States. Maybe, the idea of the road to how we got to now, if that makes sense. So, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. And once again, I hope these videos have been helpful.